My millionaire son visited me on Thanksgiving Day and inquired, "Mom, did you enjoy the lake house I gifted you?" Incredulous, I responded, "What residence? Never did I receive anything." My daughter-in-law, who was in pursuit of wealth, approached him gradually. "I am delighted to have you present. Follow my narrative until its conclusion and provide a comment regarding the metropolis from which you are viewing it, allowing me to gauge the extent of its progression." I never imagined that a straightforward inquiry on Thanksgiving would shake everything I believed to be true about my existence. I have been rationing my blood pressure medication, donning the same worn parka through 2 harsh winters, and struggling to make ends meet on my janitor's salary for the past 2 years. However, I assured myself that it was a transitory situation and that things would improve. David, my son, had established an empire from scratch. He was the proprietor of a prosperous technology consulting firm that employed more than 200 individuals when he was 35 years old. I was pleased of him, despite the fact that our conversations had evolved into brief phone calls regarding business meetings and client banquets. David was consumed by his work after his father's passing 3 years ago, and I comprehended his fervor. Grief has a unique impact on each individual. The residence had a distinct ambiance on the morning of Thanksgiving. I had spent hours preparing his favored dishes, despite the fact that the grocery bill would necessitate foregoing lunch for the upcoming week. I was determined to ensure that everything was impeccable for his visit, despite the fact that my modest kitchen could scarcely accommodate all of the pots and pans. It had been 4 months since I had last encountered him in person. Upon David's arrival at my front door, I was immediately captivated by the extravagant appearance of everything. Even his casual sweater, shoes, and watch are likely to exceed my monthly rent. Victoria, his bride of 3 years, followed him. She donned a cream-colored garment that appeared to be meant for a magazine. Despite the November wind, her blonde hair was flawlessly styled. David briefly hugged me before stepping back to assist Victoria with her outerwear, saying, "Mom, the house smells incredible." She smiled at me with the same refined expression she always wore, but her eyes appeared to be calculating something. David discussed the possibility of expanding his business to the West Coast as we dined. Victoria intermittently addressed their most recent excursion to Europe and the renovations they were contemplating for their residence. Even though each detail served as a reminder of the increasing distance between my existence and theirs, I smiled and nodded. David then reclined back in his chair and smiled as I served the pumpkin pie. "My mother, I have been intending to inquire about a matter that has been on my mind." I seated the pie server and devoted my undivided attention to him. "How are you finding the lake house that I gifted you 2 years ago? I am aware that you have always enjoyed spending time in close proximity to the water." The words struck me with the force of cold water. I gazed at him, my mouth slightly agape, as I endeavored to comprehend his recent statement. "Lake house?" I felt my heartbeat accelerate as perplexity enveloped me. "Honey, which lake house are you referring to? I never received any lake house." David's smile was shaky. He peered at Victoria, who had become extremely still in his presence. "Zion's Trenton residence situated on Lake Morrison. 2 years ago, I had it transferred to your name in honor of your birthday. Are you unable to recall?" I gingerly swayed my head as I was experiencing a sense of vertigo. "David, I would recall receiving a home. I have never received anything of the nature. Are you certain that you are not considering someone else?" Victoria abruptly rose from her seat, causing her napkin to tumble to the ground. She exclaimed, "Oh, I just remembered," her voice slightly elevated from her customary level. "I must contact someone regarding the appointment that is scheduled for tomorrow. I apologize." She swiftly approached the kitchen, retrieving her phone. However, her gait appeared to be off. My stomach contracted as a result of the urgency. David was now frowning, his businessman's mind evidently engaged in the process of resolving a conundrum. "No, Mother, that is not feasible. My assistant was specifically responsible for all of the documentation. The deed was intended to be sent to you via mail, and monthly maintenance payments were also to have been established. Recurring installments." There was a sensation of weakness in my legs. What are the regular payments? I have been mailing you $1,500 each month to assist with your expenses. I was assured by my assistant that you were receiving all of the necessary items. The room appeared to be in a state of imbalance. $1,500 per month for a period of 2 years. That amounted to $36,000. Enough to have fundamentally altered my life. Enough to acquire the medications required to repair my vehicle, to refrain from worrying about each grocery purchase. I grasped the table's edge. David, I vow to you that I have not received any monthly payments. I have been experiencing financial difficulties in order to cover the cost of my blood pressure medication. Last month, I was compelled to prioritize my electric bill over my grocery shopping. David's visage turned a shade of colorless. He abruptly stood up, his chair grinding against the floor. That is not feasible. I possess bank transactions and receipts. It is imperative that all information be recorded. Victoria's voice, which was subdued and urgent, could be heard emanating from the kitchen. However, I was unable to discern the words. As the full weight of the situation began to settle over me, my hands began to tremble. I murmured, "Show me. Please provide me with the documentation." David was already removing his phone and browsing through emails with a growing sense of urgency. I possess duplicates of all documents, including the deed transfer and payment confirmations, at my residence. Mom, where has this money been going if you have not been receiving it? At the same time, we both turned toward the kitchen. Victoria's speech had ceased. I felt regretful and oppressed by the silence. I arose on wobbly legs and proceeded toward the kitchen doorway. Victoria was positioned with her back to us. The phone was placed near her ear, but she was no longer speaking. She whirled around, her face flushed as soon as she heard our footfall. "All is well?" David inquired, but his demeanor had altered. When he suspected that an individual was not being truthful during business meetings, he employed this intonation. Of course, Victoria's smile appeared strained as she confirmed our dinner arrangements for tomorrow. But now I could see it, the remorse that was written across her features, the apprehensive way she was fidgeting with her wedding ring, the fact that she was unable to quite meet my eyes. David spoke slowly to Victoria. "Are you familiar with the documentation for the lake house? You assisted my assistant in coordinating a number of tasks during that period. The calm that ensued seemed to last indefinitely. Victoria's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. I was aware that she had taken what was intended for me at that instant, as I observed her expression. The Thanksgiving that I had labored so diligently to perfect was on the brink of becoming the day my family disintegrated. The eerie silence in my diminutive dining room was akin to a taut wire that was poised to fracture. Victoria was transfixed in the kitchen doorway, her hands clasped so closely that her knuckles had turned white. Her hands were perfectly manicured. David's expression was a unique blend of growing suspicion and perplexity as he gazed at his wife. I whispered, "Victoria," trying to maintain my composure. "What is the location of my lake house?" She forced a hard intake, her gaze alternating between David and me. "I suspect that there is a misunderstanding. It is possible that the documentation was misplaced in the mail. Alternatively, it is possible that the bank made an error." However, I could observe the deception forming in her pupils as she spoke. I had acquired the ability to read people after 15 years of working as a custodian, scrubbing offices late at night. You observe a great deal when you are invisible to the majority of people and they converse around you as if you are not present. Victoria was not particularly adept at deception. David once more produced his smartphone. "I am contacting Rebecca, my assistant. She personally managed all of this." Victoria immediately stepped forward and said, "No, wait. Perhaps we should first engage in a private conversation regarding this matter. Your mother has endured a great deal, and I am hesitant to cause her any further distress if this is merely a simple misunderstanding." I sensed a cold wrath accumulating in my bosom. I was even more distressed. She was wearing designer clothing and taking European excursions, while I had been subsisting on peanut butter and crackers for dinner most nights. However, I maintained my composure. "My dear Victoria, I believe we have reached the point where we no longer need to be concerned about causing me distress. I require information regarding the location of my residence. David had already initiated the telephone call. I heard a woman's voice on the other end within seconds. "Rebecca, my name is David. I require you to retrieve the documentation for the lake cottage that I acquired for my mother 2 years ago." A lull ensued. David activated the speaker function on the phone, which resulted in Rebecca's voice becoming more audible. "Certainly, Mr. Harrison, the property located at 1247 Lake Morrison Drive. 2 years ago, on November 15th, the deed was transferred to Margaret Harrison. I possess duplicates of all the signed documents. My pulse was pounding. That was my given name. I had never signed any paperwork, but I provided my address for the paperwork. Additionally, what are the periodic installments?" David inquired. "Everything was executed in accordance with the request. The account you designated will receive $1,500 on the 1st of each month. Margaret Harrison serves as the account proprietor. Routing number that concludes in 4782. I perceive the sensation of blood evaporating from my visage. I do not possess an account that concludes in 4782. The final number of my account is 9156. David's attention was immediately drawn to Victoria. "Is it possible for you to read the complete account number to me, Rebecca?" Victoria's expression deteriorated as Rebecca recited the figures. "It was not my account. It was not even close." David's voice was dangerously subdued as he addressed Rebecca. "Who furnished you with this account information?" "Your fiancé, sir." "Mrs. In December of 2 years ago, Harrison contacted me to inform me that your mother's banking information had been altered. She supplied me with the new account and routing numbers and requested that I revise all of the records." David's hand marginally slid as he held the phone. Victoria uttered a small, distressed sound from the back of her larynx. David proceeded with the act. To whom was it intended to be sent? The address that Mrs. Harrison supplied. "I will investigate. Apartment 2B is located at 847 Maple Street." I had never resided on Maple Street. For a decade, I had resided in the same diminutive residence. David terminated the conversation, and the subsequent silence was oppressive. He was left with a vacant expression when he gazed at Victoria, which was somehow more frightful than wrath. He replied with simplicity, "Explain." Victoria's composure was ultimately compromised. She began to weep, but the tears appeared to be more indicative of distress than contrition. "David, you must comprehend. My parents were on the brink of losing their residence. They are elderly, and my father's medical expenses were causing them to go insolvent. I temporarily borrowed the money." "Borrowed?" I murmured. "Did you intend to steal?" "False." Victoria's voice increased in volume. "I intended to reimburse it. I merely required the lake house and time. It is not as though you were employing it. In order to facilitate their recovery, my family required lodging. I experienced a sensation of a fissure in my sternum. It is not as though I was employing it. Victoria, I have been working double shifts in order to pay for my medication. In an effort to further extend my grocery budget, I have been consuming only 1 meal per day. I have been unable to increase the temperature of my home beyond 60 degrees due to the high cost of electricity." David gazed at his wife with awe as if he had never seen her before. "Victoria, it is possible that my mother would have passed away. What if she had experienced a medical emergency and was unable to afford treatment? However, she failed to do so." Victoria lamented in despair. "She is in good health. She is in good health. My father is afflicted with diabetes and cardiovascular issues. He required the funds more urgently." The callousness of her words struck me like a physical strike. "In good health." I contemplated the nights when I would lie awake, my thorax constricted with tension, and contemplate how I would afford my subsequent prescription. The instances in which I had stood in the grocery store, calculator in hand, and returned items that I could not afford. "What is the current location of my residence?" I inquired, my voice scarcely rising above a murmur. Victoria's designer makeup was smeared as she cleaned her nose with the back of her hand. "My parents and my brother's family reside there." David stated matter-of-factly, "They have been renovating it and making improvements with my money." Victoria's expression was bereft of joy. I collapsed into my chair, overcome with an abrupt sense of exhaustion. For 2 years, I had convinced myself that David was too preoccupied to regularly check on me, and that his success relieved him of the responsibility of caring for his mother. I had been pleased of his independence despite the fact that I was struggling alone. However, during this period he believed that he was providing for me. He believed that I was at ease and secure. David addressed his mother with a minor tremor in his voice. I am deeply apologetic. I was under the impression that you were in good health. I was under the impression that you possessed all the necessary items. I gazed upon my son, a successful individual who had dedicated his life to establishing a more prosperous existence, and I recognized the young boy who had once pledged to provide for me when he reached adulthood. He had endeavored to fulfill that commitment. However, the individual in whom he placed the highest level of trust had stolen it from both of us. What is the amount? Victoria was the individual I consulted. What percentage of my funds did you withdraw? She maintained her silence for an extended period. Is it all? She finally uttered a murmur. A residence that was likely worth at least $200,000 more in addition to $36,000. Victoria's family had been living lavishly on funds that were intended to protect me from destitution. David's movements were deliberate and controlled as he steadily stood up. Victoria, please prepare your belongings. I would like you to vacate my residence tonight, she implored David. Please, as she reached for him. This can be rectified. I will rectify the situation. I will devise a method to reimburse your mother. He recoiled from her embrace. With which funds? You have not worked a single day since we were married. My mother was robbed of everything you possess and everything your family has been relying on. I observed my daughter-in-law's disintegration without any emotion. There is no pity, no gratification, only a hollow vacancy in the place where trust once was. She had gazed upon me for 2 years, seated herself at this very table, and was aware that I was experiencing hardship while her family lived in opulence at my expense. I came to the realization that this Thanksgiving would be indelible, but not because of the family gathering I had hoped for, as the reverberating cries of triumph reverberated through my diminutive dining room. I would always remember the day I discovered that the individuals who smile the brightest are often the ones who are concealing the deepest secrets. Following Victoria's departure that evening, in which she wept and begged for forgiveness that neither David nor I could grant, my residence assumed an entirely different atmosphere. Quieter, but not tranquil. The silence was thick with unanswered questions and the weight of betrayal that seemed to settle into every corner. David was eager to contact his attorney immediately. However, I advised him to delay. Not because I was having second thoughts about pursuing this, but because I was convinced that we needed to know the complete extent of Victoria's actions before going forward. It is uncommon for thieves to commit a single theft, and I had a suspicion that the issue was more complex than a property and a few monthly payments. As David sat across from me at my kitchen table, his costly suit was wrinkled from the long, miserable day. "Mom, you don't need to do anything," he said. "Allow me to manage all matters. You have endured an abundance of hardships." Nevertheless, I shook my head. Victoria's fabrications had plagued me for 2 years. She had been systematically robbing me of the little security I may have had, while I was powerless and unaware. I was now aware of the truth and was determined not to allow others to manage my affairs. I must observe the entirety of it. I informed him of each document, bank record, and piece of documentation. It is imperative that I comprehend the precise nature of her actions toward me. I called in ill to work for the first time in 2 years the following morning, after David had returned home to change clothing and gather documents. Mrs. Henderson, my supervisor, was taken aback but empathetic when I informed her of my family emergency. If only she were aware. David returned with his laptop and crates of documents. We arranged everything on my diminutive dining table, the same table where Victoria had sat mere hours prior, assuming the role of the apprehensive daughter-in-law while concealing her transgressions. The deed to the lake house was the initial document we examined. The document I had never seen before bore my signature, which was as visible as day. However, as I gazed upon it, I detected an anomaly. I pointed to the signature and stated, "This is not the manner in which I sign my name. Examine the letter M in Margaret. I consistently construct it with a small spiral at the top, but this particular version is composed entirely of straight lines." David retrieved his smartphone and captured a photograph of the signature. Subsequently, he located an outdated birthday card that I had signed for him the previous year. Once one was aware of the distinctions, they were apparent, despite their subtlety. He stated, "She forged your signature," his voice trembling with fury. We continued to excavate. The bank records indicated that the monthly payments were being deposited into an account that was indeed in my name, but it was located at a bank with which I had never conducted business. An individual had established an account by utilizing my personal information. "I must view this account," I declared. David attempted to obtain information from the bank via telephone. However, they declined to provide it due to his lack of account ownership. I entered the marble vestibule of First National Bank with my driver's license and social security card, my palms shaking as we drove there together. Just weeks prior to the initial payment, the account had been established for 2 years and 1 month. The address that was recorded was 847 Maple Street, Apartment 2B, the same address that Rebecca had previously specified. My telephone number was also not included. "Ma'am," the bank representative stated, her expression betraying confusion as she perused the records. "You have never previously visited this branch, have you?" I responded with firmness. "I have never visited this location in my life." She presented us with the signature card that was issued upon the account's opening. The identical counterfeit version of my identity, signed by an individual who was not me. The representative expressed concern, stating that this is identity theft. It is imperative that you promptly submit a police report. However, we were not yet finished. David had brought copies of all of his financial records that were pertinent to my care. As we sat in the bank's customer service area, a more comprehensive perspective began to emerge. The periodic payments were merely the beginning. David had also been sending me supplementary funds to cover my medical expenses, which I had never seen. $500 was paid when he believed I required new spectacles, $800 for dental work that he believed was necessary, and $1,000 as a bonus last Christmas. The fraudulent account had received each and every payment. "What is the amount?" I inquired, despite my apprehension regarding the response. David's fingertips traversed the calculator on his smartphone. His complexion became paler. $43,000. "She embezzled $43,000 from you over the course of 2 years. I experienced feelings of vertigo. I had never had more money in my life than $43,000. This was sufficient to alter everything, to provide me with security and solace in my later years, rather than the perpetual tension of living paycheck to paycheck." Next, we proceeded to 847 Maple Street. The apartment complex was dilapidated and located on the opposite side of town. It was characterized by cracked concrete steps and fading fluorescent signs. A for rent sign was displayed in the window of apartment 2B, which was vacant. David, his mandible clenched with fury, speculated that she likely rented the property for a brief period in order to establish the fictitious address. I was, however, preoccupied with another matter. "David, how did she obtain my personal information?" "The information she would require to establish the account includes my social security number and date of birth." For a brief period, he maintained his silence. "I maintain copies of critical family documents in my home office, which is located in our residence. She would have had access to all resources." The betrayal became more profound with each new revelation. Victoria had not merely recognized an opportunity and seized it. She had meticulously devised this scheme, residing in my son's residence, dining at his table and feigning affection for him, all the while systematically appropriating my identity and finances. David gazed at me with tears in his eyes as we sat in my living room, surrounded by evidence of Victoria's offenses that evening. "I am deeply apologetic, Mother. I had complete faith in her. I never considered verifying that you were receiving the money, as she was the one who initially recommended that I send it. That information struck me with the force of cold water. She proposed it. Miserably," David acknowledged. "She expressed her concern regarding your ability to manage independently approximately 6 months following Dad's passing. She expressed that it would be an exceptional act of kindness if I could assist with your expenses, particularly in light of the prosperous nature of your business." She even extended an offer to collaborate with Rebecca to establish everything. I closed my eyes, absorbing the full force of Victoria's manipulation. She had assumed the role of the compassionate daughter-in-law, expressing concern for her husband's ailing mother, while simultaneously ensuring that every dollar intended for me was ultimately pocketed by her family. The lake home is the same. She stated that you had expressed a desire to reside near water and that it would be beneficial for your happiness and well-being. She assisted me in locating the property, negotiated the price, and managed all of the documentation. Victoria had managed to manipulate my son like a violin, exploiting his affection for me to our mutual detriment. She had systematically robbed me of everything he had attempted to give me, while simultaneously making him feel generous and compassionate. I was alone in my living room, gazing at the walls that I had become so accustomed to over the past 2 years, as David collected the papers to take to his counsel. My reality was not intended to be this tiny, cramped space, complete with outdated furnishings and a malfunctioning air conditioner. I was anticipated to be residing in a luxurious residence by the lake, with sufficient funds to purchase my medications without the need to tally pennies. Rather, Victoria's parents are likely currently relaxing by the lake, savoring their stolen retirement, while I have been rationing my blood pressure medication and donning second-hand clothing. However, the initial step toward regaining control of my life was the realization of the truth, despite the suffering it caused. Victoria had stolen more than just money from me. She had seized 2 years of security, dignity, and the peace of mind that comes with knowing your child is taking care of you. We would commence the procedure of reclaiming all of it tomorrow. However, for the first time in 2 years, I went to bed tonight with a clear understanding of my position, and that knowledge, despite its bitterness, felt like power. David's attorney contacted him the following morning to provide him with the findings of his investigation. I was scouring the floors of the office building where I had been employed for the previous 10 years. My palms were raw from the industrial cleaning solutions, and my knees ached against the chilly tile. However, I persisted in my employment because I required every penny produced by this position. At least, I believed that I did. Mrs. Harrison. During my lunch break, I contacted Mr. Patterson, and his voice was bleak. It is imperative that we convene immediately. The information we have discovered is significantly more extensive than our initial assumptions. David collected me from my shift, his expression betraying his exhaustion. Since Thanksgiving, he had spent little time sleeping, dedicating himself to the investigation with the same level of commitment that he applied to his business dealings. However, this was not a business transaction. This was deeply personal, and it was wrecking him. We sat across from Mr. Patterson at the lawyer's office as he organized a file that was replete with documents. Mrs. Harrison, Victoria did not merely pilfer from you. She has been conducting what is essentially a small-scale fraud operation by utilizing your identity. The room appeared to be in a state of imbalance. Victoria had utilized my personal information to establish 3 distinct bank accounts at various financial institutions, as he elaborated. She had applied for credit cards in my name, obtained a small loan, and even submitted false tax returns that claimed me as a dependent while reporting income that I had never earned. Mr. Patterson continued, "The IRS has been attempting to contact you regarding discrepancies in your tax filings. They have been sending notifications to the fictitious address. You are currently being investigated for tax evasion. I experienced a sensation of being submerged. Evasion of taxes? However, I have consistently submitted my taxes in a truthful manner. We are aware of this information at this time. However, the Internal Revenue Service is not. Victoria has been informing us that you have received the funds that David sent, the sum of money that you never received. From their standpoint, you have been concealing your income." David's wrists were tightened into fists. What was the entire amount of money that she stole? Mr. Patterson reviewed numerous documents which encompassed the initial $43,000, as well as additional credit card expenditures, loan proceeds, and fraudulent tax refunds. We are considering an amount of approximately $78,000. The number struck me with the force of a physical strike. $78,000. I earned $18,000 annually by cleaning floors. Victoria had embezzled more than 4 years of my salary. Additionally, what about the residence? That is the point at which the situation becomes more intricate. Mr. Patterson stated that the property is lawfully in your name, Mrs. Harrison, as evidenced by the forged deed. In fact, the property value has increased considerably as a result of the enhancements that Victoria's family has made with the stolen money while residing there. I contemplated Victoria's parents, whom I had encountered only twice at family gatherings. They appeared to be kind individuals, somewhat overwhelmed by their daughter's affluent lifestyle, but appreciative of her accomplishments. Had they been aware of the source of the funds? Had they been aware that they were residing in a residence that had been seized from the mother of their son-in-law? Is it possible to retrieve it? David inquired. Certainly, but it will be necessary to involve law enforcement. This is no longer a civil dispute. This constitutes tax evasion, identity theft, and criminal misconduct. Victoria could potentially be sentenced to significant penitentiary time. After a prolonged period of silence, I reflected on the woman who had sat at my table mere days prior, weeping and imploring for mercy. She appeared to be sincerely remorseful. However, I am now uncertain as to whether those emotions were genuine or merely another form of deception. What about her family? I inquired about her parents and her sibling, who was responsible for the children. Mr. Patterson maintained a firm yet sympathetic demeanor. They will be required to vacate the premises. They may evade criminal charges if they can demonstrate that they were unaware that the money was taken. However, they are unable to retain the items purchased with fraudulent funds. David's mandible was clenched as he gazed out the window. Victoria's current location is unknown. She is currently residing at the lake home with her parents. According to Mr. Patterson, our investigator verified that she has been present at the location since she departed your residence on Thanksgiving. David bitterly stated that she immediately proceeded to the individuals who had been subsisting on my mother's misappropriated funds. Certainly she did. That afternoon, we traveled to Lake Morrison by car. I had never seen the house that was purportedly mine, and I gasped in spite of myself as we entered the lengthy driveway. It was breathtaking. A spacious ranch-style residence with expansive windows that provide a view of the water, encircled by mature trees and meticulously maintained gardens. David had intended for me to receive this. I could have spent my retirement years viewing the sunset over the lake in this peaceful, comfortable location, rather than fretting about whether I could afford my next meal. David and I were greeted by Victoria's father, who was visibly distressed upon recognizing us. He said calmly, "Oh. We have been anticipating your arrival." Victoria appeared behind him, appearing diminutive and youthful than I had ever seen her. Her face was puffy from weeping, and her designer clothing had been replaced with denim and an old sweater. "Margaret," she declared, her voice scarcely rising above a murmur. "I am deeply apologetic." I gazed upon her, this woman who had smiled at me across innumerable dinner tables while systematically eroding my financial stability, and I was overcome with a savage, icy wrath. "Are you present?" I inquired. "Victoria, are you truly apologetic, or are you simply apologetic for being apprehended?" She resumed weeping. However, I was unmoved. I had previously witnessed her weeping and had placed my faith in them. At times, I even harbored feelings of pity for her, as she appeared to be isolated and David worked long hours. She wept. I never intended for it to escalate to this extent. It began with my parents borrowing the initial payment to assist them with their mortgage. David's voice was as cold as ice as he stated, "I was going to return it before anyone noticed, but you didn't. You continued to accumulate an increasing quantity. You fraudulently filed tax returns, opened credit cards in my mother's name, and seized her identity. Victoria, that is not a form of borrowing. That constitutes deceit." A tearful Victoria's mother had emerged from the doorway. "We were unaware," she stated with urgency. "We believed that David was simply being benevolent by assisting us during a challenging period. Victoria informed us that he had been adamant about purchasing the property. I observed the eyes of this elderly woman, who was likely close to my own age, and I observed genuine astonishment and terror. She had been unaware. Victoria was the only one who was aware. I said quietly, "The IRS believes that I am a tax cheat as a result of your daughter's actions. Victoria filed false returns in my name, which could result in my imprisonment." Victoria's mother exhaled, placing a hand over her mouth. "Oh my God, Victoria, what have you done?" However, Victoria continued to weep, professing apologies and justifications that were of no consequence at this time. She had been given 2 years to confess and rectify this situation. However, she elected to delve further. Mr. Patterson emerged with a briefcase brimming with legal documents. "Mrs. Stevens, I will require you and your family to vacate this property within the next 30 days. The fraudulent funds must be returned or compensated for all items that were purchased." I experienced an unexpected emotion as I observed Victoria's family confront the reality of their circumstances. Relieved. Not satisfaction, not vengeance. Rather, it was a sense of relief that the truth was ultimately revealed. Mr. Patterson continued, "The police will be present tomorrow to apprehend Victoria. I would suggest that she involuntarily turn herself in." Victoria gazed upward at David with anguish. "I implore you to prohibit my detention. I will reimburse you for all expenses. I assure you, I will secure employment. I will be available to perform both day and night." Sadly, David shook his head. "Victoria, you have never labored a day in your life. What skills do you possess? You are not even aware of how to operate. You are proficient in only one action, taking." I paused as we exited the lake house to take one final glance at the location that was intended to serve as my residence for the previous 2 years. It would soon be completed. However, the knowledge of Victoria's theft of it has left it feeling lifeless. David addressed his mother as we departed. "I will guarantee that you will never be in need of anything again. I will provide for you in the manner that I should have been doing from the beginning." I gingerly caressed his hand. "You were providing for me, my dear. Victoria's theft of the item you gifted me is not your responsibility." However, as we returned to my tiny, confined residence, I was aware that everything was about to undergo a transformation. Victoria would be held accountable for her actions, and I would finally receive the security and solace that David had always intended for me. The altercation was concluded. Justice arrived at this time. The divorce documents were finalized on a gray Tuesday in February, 3 months after the devastating Thanksgiving dinner. David's counsel emerged from the courtroom with the news that Victoria had signed everything without contest, and I sat in the courthouse hallway beside him. She had already been sentenced to 18 months in prison for fraud and identity theft, and contesting the divorce would have resulted in additional legal expenses that she was unable to afford. Mr. Patterson sat down beside us and announced that the task had been completed. There is a dissolution of the marriage. Every asset that was acquired with misappropriated funds is returned to its legitimate proprietor. Mrs. Harrison, the lake house is now lawfully yours, and all funds in the fraudulent accounts have been blocked until full restitution is made." David exhaled deeply. "What about her family? The property was vacated last week. Her parents have been unexpectedly cooperative as they temporarily relocated to her brother's residence. I believe that they are genuinely appalled by Victoria's actions. I experienced an unusual combination of relief and melancholy. I was relieved that this torment was finally coming to an end, but I was also saddened by the collateral damage. Victoria's parents were also innocent victims, albeit in their own unique manner. Their daughter's decision to steal rather than seek assistance resulted in the loss of their residence and their resources. In all honesty, the weeks that followed were characterized by a frenzy of documentation and modifications. David applied the same level of commitment to rectifying the situation that he had previously applied to the development of his business. He personally supervised the transfer of ownership of the lake house back to me, worked with the IRS to clear my name, and engaged a team of accountants to untangle Victoria's fraudulent tax filings. However, the most significant transformation was within David himself. The successful businessman, who had been too preoccupied to make regular phone calls, became a son who visited me every few days, called to inquire about my well-being, and insisted on accompanying me to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping. "Honey, you are not required to supervise me. I informed him one afternoon as he assisted me in packing the few items I desired to retain from my previous residence. I have no intention of departing. He paused while folding one of my comforters, his hands remaining stationary on the soft fabric. Mother, I was naive enough to place my complete trust in Victoria, which resulted in my absence from your life for 2 years. I am no longer absent. I recognized his remorse, despite my belief that he did not merit it. Victoria had been an expert manipulator, exploiting his affection for me to conceal her crimes. But I also recognized that trust, once it has been so thoroughly shattered, requires a significant amount of time to be reestablished, even confidence in oneself. The transition to the lake house was akin to a dream. The location was aesthetically pleasing. However, it was burdened by the events that transpired. It had been well maintained by Victoria's family. I was compelled to acknowledge that the gardens were meticulously maintained. The residence was impeccably maintained and modernized, and I was immediately captivated by the screened veranda that provided a view of the water. However, it felt as though I were assimilating into the existence of another individual rather than reclaiming my own. As David and I traversed the chambers together, he stated, "We have the ability to modify anything you desire. New furniture, alternative paint colors, or any other element that would evoke a sense of home for you." His thoughtfulness was greatly appreciated. However, I was uncertain whether the installation of new draperies would obliterate the fact that Victoria's father had been reading the morning paper in this living room for the past 2 years, while I had been rationing my medication some 50 miles away. The process of financial restitution was more intricate than I had anticipated. The funds from the credit cards she had used and the loan she had taken out were not the only items in the accounts Victoria had opened in my name. They also included the money David had sent. Forensic accounting and months of documentation were necessary to untangle the complexities of who owned what. My new financial advisor informed me that the good news is that, in the end, you will receive not only the original amount of money that my son sent, but also accumulated interest and some additional compensation for the identity theft. When all is recovered, the cost is expected to be around $95,000. $95,000. I had never before considered owning such a substantial sum of money. I was able to live comfortably for years, never have to worry about selecting between groceries and medication again, and truly enjoy my retirement instead of working until my body gave out. However, the money felt peculiar in my hands, as it was tainted by the knowledge of its theft and subsequent recovery. I found myself yearning for the simplicity of my previous existence, in which I was aware of my precise location, despite the fact that it was barely eking by. The most challenging aspect was managing the community's response. Victoria's apprehension and prosecution were headline news in a town of our size. Everyone was aware of her actions, and as a result, everyone was aware that I had been the victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme. The responses of individuals were highly variable. Some individuals were empathetic, offering assistance and conveying their indignation on my behalf. Others appeared almost distrustful, as if they were unable to comprehend that I was unaware of the situation. A few individuals made comments that implied they believed I should be appreciative of the attention, as if being defrauded was somehow superior to being ignored. The individuals who behaved as though I had won the lottery, rather than having my identity stolen, were the most detrimental. One neighbor commented with a smile, "Well, at least it all worked out in the end." Presently, you are resting comfortably by the lake. I desired to physically assault them in order to clarify that your daughter-in-law's systematic theft of your identity and subsequent robbery over the course of 2 years is not an inevitable outcome. The money and the property were acquired with the knowledge that an individual you had previously trusted had regarded you as nothing more than a source of funds to be exploited. However, I refrained from speaking and concentrated on the reconstruction of my existence. I was alone in the lake house for the first night. I observed the sunset over the water while enjoying a cup of tea on the screened veranda. The scene was breathtakingly stunning and serene in a manner that I had never before encountered. However, I experienced an unusual sense of disconnection from it, as if I were a guest in someone else's dream. David's name was displayed on the screen when my phone called. He had been calling me every night since I had moved in to ensure that I was acclimating. "All right. Mother, how are you doing?" I gazed out at the lake, attempting to articulate the intricate amalgam of emotions that were swirling within me. "I am finally grateful," I expressed. Additionally, there are instances in which one may experience feelings of sadness, anger, and confusion simultaneously. David said quietly, "That sounds about right." I have been reflecting on Victoria's statement from the previous day, in which she stated that she had never intended for it to escalate to such an extent. I recollected her weeping and her frantic apologies. What are your thoughts on the matter? I believe she was being entirely candid about that particular aspect. I believe that she truly began with a modest scale and was unable to stop. However, this does not necessarily ameliorate the situation, does it? In fact, it exacerbates the situation. She was presented with numerous opportunities to apologize and rectify her actions, but she consistently elected to delve deeper. He was correct. Victoria's initial crime may have been motivated by impulse or desperation. However, all subsequent actions were deliberate deception. She had embraced me at holidays, listened to me fret about money, and looked me in the eye at family dinners, all while knowing that she was the reason I was struggling. When she discussed her family's renovations to the house and the enhancements they were making, I cannot help but reflect on the pride she exuded. Their accomplishments with my misappropriated money were a source of pride for her. She was not merely thieving from you, Mother. She was stealing from both of us. She stole the relationship that we should have had over the past 2 years, the tranquility I believed I was providing you. I walked through the home that was finally legally, undeniably mine after I ended up with David. It was both comfortable and aesthetically pleasing, and it fulfilled all of my expectations. However, it would require time before it began to feel like home rather than evidence of a crime. I retired to the master bedroom that evening, relaxing in a bed that belonged to me and in a home that belonged to me. I should have felt triumphant, as I had amassed an adequate amount of money to sustain me for the duration of my existence. Instead, I experienced a sense of exhaustion. However, as I drifted off to slumber to the soothing sound of water lapping against the shore, I came to the realization that exhaustion was not inherently a negative experience. The exhaustion that results from a protracted, arduous journey has finally been resolved. I could commence the process of transforming this stolen ideal into something that is truly mine tomorrow. I stood in the same screened veranda where I had spent that first disoriented night 1 year later. However, all of this had been altered. The space that had previously been unfamiliar to me now encircled me in a warm embrace. I had replaced Victoria's family's furniture with items that resonated with me, incorporated plants that I had personally selected, and hung photographs that depicted my actual life rather than someone else's stolen fantasy. The morning routine that I had established had become sacred to me. As the sun rose over the lake, I enjoyed a cup of coffee on the veranda, observing the water's transformation in response to the light. It was a luxury that I had never anticipated, this tranquility, this opportunity to exist without the perpetual burden of financial anxiety. David's vehicle arrived at the driveway precisely on time for our monthly breakfast. After his initial guilt-driven hovering had settled into a more natural state, this tradition had been established months prior. We had both acquired the ability to navigate this new relationship, which was founded on honesty rather than the false foundation Victoria had established. He called out to his mother as he entered the house, carrying a bag from the patisserie in town. It was morning. I brought those cinnamon pastries that you enjoy. I smiled as I placed 2 dishes on the kitchen table. You are not required to provide me with pastries on a weekly basis, my dear. He beamed. I am now fully capable of feeding myself. I am aware that you are, but I enjoy bringing them. Additionally, Mrs. Shen at the patisserie consistently inquires about your well-being. You have become the favored success story of half the municipality. This was accurate. The same community that had murmured about my situation during Victoria's trial had embraced me once justice was served. Many individuals approached me at the grocery store to inquire about my adjustment. When I first relocated to the lake, my neighbors brought casseroles, and the courier always made sure to mention them whenever he had happy news to share. Is there any update from the attorney regarding Victoria's appeal? I inquired as we established our customary positions at the table. David shook his head. The documentation was submitted by her public defender. However, Mr. Patterson maintains that it is essentially a formality. She pleaded guilty to all charges due to the substantial evidence. She will serve her entire sentence. When the judge announced the 18-month sentence, it appeared to be a brief period of time. However, as the seasons changed and my new existence began to take shape, I ceased to consider Victoria's timeline and began to concentrate on my own. What is your perspective on that? David inquired, meticulously observing my expression. I gave careful consideration to the inquiry. A year ago, I may have desired for Victoria to endure additional hardships, to confront repercussions that were commensurate with the magnitude of the theft. But now, as I sit in the house that was truly mine, with money in the bank and my son's authentic attention, revenge seems less significant than it once did. I eventually said, I feel like she is where she needs to be. I do not wish for her to endure pain. Rather, she must confront the genuine repercussions of her actions. It is possible that prison will provide her with a lesson that our family was unable to impart. I had acquired a greater understanding of Victoria's psychology than I had ever desired during the legal process. She had been raised in a family that faced financial hardship, and she was constantly comparing herself to those who had more. She was unexpectedly granted access to fortune that she had never anticipated upon her marriage to David. However, it appears that it was insufficient. She required the sense of being the provider, the individual capable of resolving her family's issues. According to the therapist whom her counsel recommended, she is afflicted with entitlement syndrome. David informed me months ago that she sincerely believed she merited whatever she could get because life had been unjust to her. I had contemplated that explanation for an extended period of time. Life had also been unjust to me when I lost my spouse and found myself unable to make ends meet. However, I had never considered that injustice granted me the authority to pilfer from others. Have you received any information regarding her family? I inquired. David agreed. Her parents relocated to Arizona to reside with her aunt. Her brother secured employment in a different state. In essence, they are beginning anew. I experienced a brief moment of empathy for them. My life was not the only one that Victoria's offenses had devastated. Her parents had forfeited their residence and their resources. Victoria's decision to prioritize thievery over honesty resulted in the displacement of her brother's children from their schools and social circles. I mentioned that I have been contemplating the development of a letter to them. David raised his eyebrows. Honestly? What would be your response? That I do not hold them accountable and that I trust that they are in good health. I took a moment to incorporate sugar into my coffee. Victoria made her decisions, however, they required no compensation. For an extended period, we observed the lake in tranquility. I had developed the habit of scattering breadcrumbs from my morning toast to a family of geese that had established a home in the vicinity of the shore. Every moment was consumed with survival, and I had never had the opportunity to indulge in simple delights. David ultimately stated, I have something to tell you, his demeanor becoming increasingly grave. I gazed at him with eagerness. I have been seeing a woman whom I encountered at a business conference. Jennifer is her name, and she is not at all similar to Victoria. I experienced a brief moment of anxiety, but I was able to calm down. Please provide me with information regarding her. In reality, she is a forensic accountant. She assists organizations in the investigation of financial irregularities. She is aware of Victoria's actions, has a comprehensive understanding of the entire narrative, and is not motivated by my financial gain. She generates substantial revenue on her own. I grinned. A forensic accountant. That appears to be appropriate. David chuckled. I believed you would find the irony amusing. Additionally, she is exceedingly candid, occasionally to the point of being ruthless. On our third date, she informed me that she believed I was overly trusting and that I needed to improve my boundaries. A woman of intelligence. When will I have the opportunity to meet her? Only if you desire to. This time I am not in a hurry. I am regaining confidence in my own judgment, and part of that entails refraining from seeking approbation from others before I am aware of my own emotions. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I am proud of you for taking your time, but I would be delighted to meet her when you are prepared. Following David's departure, I conducted my customary stroll around the premises. The gardens that Victoria's family had established were flourishing under my supervision. However, I had implemented my own modifications. A reading alcove beneath the ancient oak tree, a vegetable plot where I cultivated herbs and tomatoes, and a bird feeder that drew cardinals and blue jays. The residence was becoming mine in ways that were unrelated to legal ownership. It was replete with my memories, my choices, and my private daily routines which no one could pilfer, forge, or manipulate. I executed a plan that I had been premeditating for several weeks that afternoon. I contacted Mrs. Henderson, my former supervisor at the cleaning company. Margaret Harrison is the individual in question. I am writing to inform you that I will not be returning to work. A lull ensued. Margaret, are you currently experiencing any discomfort? You have been absent for an extended period of time. I stated, I am experiencing the best health I have experienced in years, and I smiled in recognition of the reality. I am resigning. It was peculiar to articulate the term. I never anticipated that I would be able to retire. I had presumed that I would continue to work until my body failed. However, the house, David's ongoing support, and the money Victoria had stolen and recovered allowed me to cease cleaning other people's floors and begin living for myself. I sat on my veranda that evening, sipping a glass of wine, and observed the lake be painted in hues of gold and pink by the sunset. David sent me a text message which caused my phone to vibrate. Jennifer is interested in learning whether you have a preference for Italian cuisine. She is contemplating preparing a meal for you next weekend. I responded by typing, please inform her that I have a fondness for Italian cuisine. However, she is not required to impress me. I already have a fondness for individuals who bring joy to my son. I reflected on the woman I had been a year ago as darkness settled over the water. Tired, struggling, and proud, yet discreetly frantic. She would have never imagined that this tranquility, this sense of security and contentment was feasible. Victoria's offenses had robbed 2 years of my life, but in an unusual twist, they had also provided me with an opportunity that I may not have had otherwise. David was compelled to genuinely perceive me, to recognize that I required more than mere financial assistance. I required his presence, his undivided attention, and his sincere concern. Additionally, they had imparted knowledge regarding my own fortitude. I had endured the larceny, the investigation, the trial, and the intricate process of reclaiming my identity in my life. I had discovered that I was more resilient than I had previously recognized, and that I was more resilient than I had ever needed to be. However, I had also acquired knowledge regarding forgiveness. Not forgiveness for Victoria, who would have to earn it through genuine change that I may never witness, but forgiveness for myself for being trusting enough to believe in her falsehoods, and forgiveness for David, who had been manipulated just as comprehensively as I had been. I experienced the profound satisfaction that results from a day well lived in a life that has been reclaimed as I closed up the home and retired for the night. New small delights, new quiet joys, and new moments of calm that no one could steal would be introduced tomorrow. The lake house that had originated as Victoria's crime scene had evolved into my refuge. The money that had been misappropriated and subsequently recovered had served as my security. The son who had been deceived into neglecting me had become my devoted companion. Victoria had attempted to rob me of my future. However, in the end, she had only postponed it. I was now free to live in any manner I desired, and I opted for serenity. I am now inquisitive about the individual who listened to my narrative. What would you do if you were in my position?